In the early 1900s, the life of 19-year-old Grace Brown seemed like a dream come true. She was a farm girl who had moved to a big city and fallen in love with the handsome nephew of a wealthy factory owner. When Grace then found out she was pregnant, the only thing she needed was Chester Gillette to pop the question. Instead, what had started as a fairy tale quickly turned into a nightmare. Born in South Ostelic, New York on March the 20th, 1886, Grace Brown was the fifth of 9 children of Frank Brown and his wife, Betsy Minerva Babcock. Her early life was that of any farm girl at the time. She participated in chores and helped tend to the family's land and animals until the Norwich National Bank foreclosed on the farm when she was 9. Perhaps because of this, Grace was allowed to stay at school longer than her siblings, and she graduated from Tallet Hill, a one-room school just under a mile away from the family home, when she was 16. She was described as a lively young lady who made friends easily and loved singing and dancing. She especially loved a song called "Won't You Come Home, Bill Bailey." This eventually earned her the nickname Billy, and she began to sign her letters "The Kid" with reference to the Western outlaw Billy the Kid. Typically for the era, Grace dreamed about getting out of the tiny village and exploring the great wide world for herself. This didn't seem likely, however. After finishing school, she began working on a farm on the outskirts of Norwich, New York, though she would only remain there for a few months before returning home. Grace would finally make her escape in 1904. Her sister Ada had recently married and now lived in the nearby city of Cortland. Upon visiting her, Grace was instantly seduced by the bright lights and opportunities city life seemed to offer. She moved in with Ada and her husband Clarence and initially cared for her nephew before finding a job at the Gillette skirt factory. The pay was just a few dollars a week, about $100 in today's money, but it was more money than the teenager had ever seen on the farm. Life in the city must have been very exciting for Grace, and she was not going to give that up. Ada and Clarence eventually left Cortland after their son Robert tragically died, leaving Grace without a home. She needed to choose whether to return to South Ostelic to her parents or stay in Cortland. For Grace, the decision was likely easy to make. She could not have known that by staying in the city, she sealed her fate. After her sister's departure, she moved to the former Wheeler farmhouse on the edge of the city, a stone's throw away from the Gillette skirt factory. It was then that Grace met the owner's nephew, a handsome socialite named Chester Ellsworth Gillette. Born on August 9, 1883 in Wicks, Montana, Chester was the son of a silver miner, Frank Gillette, and his wife, Louisa. When Chester was just a boy, the family moved to Spokane, Washington, where they lived quite comfortably until the Great Fire of 1889. The fire destroyed virtually all the family's belongings, and in the face of this adversity, they found strength in their religion, becoming members of the Salvation Army. At this point in time, the Salvation Army was seen as being much more radical than they are today, and the Gillettes found themselves traveling across the state in an effort to convert people. Louisa would even visit prisons in an effort to turn hardened criminals and murderers into followers, all with young Chester in tow. Needless to say, his upbringing was not particularly settled and stable, and this might explain why Chester grew up to be a shiftless young man, not especially committed to anything. In an effort to offer his nephew more stability, Chester's wealthy Uncle Noah, owner of the skirt factory, secured him a place at the costly and prestigious Oberlin College in Ohio. Things began to look up for him there, and his first-year grades were very good. This wouldn't be the case in his second year, however, as a growing interest in girls and basketball saw his grades take a dip before he dropped out of Oberlin altogether. While this was playing out, Chester's family had abandoned the Salvation Army after his father, Frank, fell ill. In an effort to alleviate his condition, they became members of the Christian Catholic Church of Zion, a sect that were big proponents of faith healing and had created a commune outside of Chicago, which they called Zion City. Chester wasn't interested in his parents' religious choices, but wanted to remain nearby, and so he moved to Chicago in 1903. There, he moved from job to job until his Uncle Noah once again stepped in. He offered Chester the opportunity to come to Cortland and work for him full-time, and the young man accepted. So, in April 1905, Chester Gillette stepped into the skirt factory and, at the same time, into the life of 19-year-old Grace Brown. If you simply looked at Chester Gillette without actually knowing him, he was what many may consider a catch. He was young, charming, handsome, and the nephew of a very wealthy businessman. So when he suddenly started to make visits to a simple but beautiful farm girl's table, Grace quickly fell for him. It's claimed that a ring slipped from Grace's hand and rolled across the floor until it hit Chester's foot, and that was how the two initially began talking. They would have long phone calls and occasionally meet outside work, but always behind closed doors. Chester may have been attracted to Grace physically and maybe found her company pleasant too, but he had been warned not to fraternize with factory girls, lest he bring the Gillette name into disrepute. So, while Grace was building a love story in her head, Chester did everything he could to keep the relationship a secret, most likely never informing Grace about the true nature of the affair. There were definitely others who tried to make Grace understand what was going on. Author Craig Brandon, who has written several books on the case, states, quote, "Her friends were warning her that he wasn't what he seemed to be, that he was something different, and I think that she had no experience with that type of person. And so, she was seeing what she wanted to see rather than what her friends were telling her." End quote. The young Gillette never appeared in public with Brown, though he was seen with many other women of high social standing and from wealthy families. One in particular that caught his eye was a woman named Harriet Benedict. She was a lawyer's daughter and socially the polar opposite of Grace. Grace was upset at hearing constant rumors about his conduct, but at the same time, she could not just end the relationship. She was hooked, likely in love for the first time in her life. So she kept putting up with her beau's neglect, hoping things would get better one day. Instead, they would get much, much worse. In the spring of 1906, Grace found out she was pregnant, which changed everything. As an unwed mother at the dawn of the 20th century, she would have been seen as an outcast. This would have undoubtedly filled her with fear, but at the same time, maybe there was a way out. Perhaps she and Chester could be wed, the pair settling down with Chester becoming a husband and father and ending his carefree womanizing ways. Gillette would have other ideas. When he was informed of the pregnancy, he simply decided to ignore the problem and hope it would go away. He eventually convinced her to move back to the farm in South Otselic, but the pair kept exchanging letters. With Grace out of the picture, however, he quickly began seeing Harriet again, even cancelling a planned visit to see Grace in favour of a date with the lawyer's daughter. In time, Grace became more and more desperate and began to speak about death. At the time, it was sadly not uncommon for women to take their own lives rather than face public shame. One of her letters read, quote, "Chester, if I could only die. I know how you feel about this affair, and I wish, for your sake, you need not be troubled. If I die, I hope you can then be happy. My life is ruined, and, in a measure, yours is too. The world, and you too, may think I am the one to blame, but somehow I can't. Just simply can't think that I am. I said no so many times." End quote. Fearful and afraid, she would also imply in letters that she would return to Cortland and tell everyone what kind of man Chester really was. She eventually abandoned any attempts at convincing him to marry her. Instead, she simply asked that he find some time to help her find a place to settle down after the child was born. He eventually agreed to meet with her, but this encounter would prove to be a fateful one. On the 8th of July 1906, Chester and Grace packed their bags and headed off from Cortland and Otselic respectively. It's claimed that Grace had packed her entire wardrobe. The couple met aboard a train at De Ruyter as agreed and stayed the night together at the Tabor Hotel in Utica, New York. Chester had booked the room under the name Charles Gordon to match his CEG monogrammed luggage. Grace knew this and did not find it odd considering the situation. They eventually travelled to Tupper Lake, but were reportedly disappointed with the views and so moved on to Big Moose Lake in Herkimer County, staying at the Glenmore Hotel. This time, Chester used the name Carl Graham, but Grace was checked in with her real name. On July 11th, Gillette rented a 17-foot skiff from a man named Robert Morrison. He and Grace then rowed out to one of the lake's most secluded spots. When the sun then set over Big Moose Lake later that evening, Robert was not too concerned about the fact that the couple had not yet returned. Sometimes the visitors misjudged the size and scale of the lake, but Chester and Grace never returned at all. A search party was formed the following day and eventually found the rowboat overturned. In the shallows of the lake, a body. It was 20-year-old Grace Brown. At first, it all seemed like a tragic accident, but when police were unable to find a second body, they had to consider other, more sinister options. Especially because it was clear Grace had suffered repeated blows to the head from a blunt object. Not typical injuries for someone simply falling from a boat and drowning. When officers contacted the Brown family, they were informed that Grace had not spent time with anyone named Carl Graham, but was known to associate with a man named Chester Gillette. A search for the socialite quickly followed. It was soon revealed that a man dressed in a suit had been spotted walking through the nearby woods by hikers. With this lead, it wasn't long before Gillette was tracked down at the Arrowhead Hotel in the nearby town of Inlet, socializing, laughing, and even bragging about a drowning back at Big Moose Lake. In the days after the murder, he had kept up the appearance of a holidaymaker, hiking trails and even paddling out onto another lake. The day after police had discovered his whereabouts, Chester was arrested. A post-mortem examination of Grace's body showed that she had suffered a beating before taking her last breath. The investigators soon located Grace's belongings in the town of Old Forge, including the numerous letters detailing the problematic relationship. When he was then questioned, Chester told the officers he was present when she drowned, though he claimed she had taken her own life. His trial began at the Herkimer County Courthouse on November 12, 1906. The prosecution told the jury that Chester's tennis racket, which he brought with him to Big Moose Lake, had been found broken and useless. Chester's claims of Grace jumping in the water did not explain her head injuries, but him hitting her with the racket did. Gillette's version of the events also did not make any sense, considering he claimed the young woman had committed suicide, but he hadn't immediately alerted the authorities. Instead, he had travelled to another hotel where he carried on unperturbed by what he had apparently just witnessed. Several letters were used as evidence during the trial, proving Chester had a motive to kill his secret lover. The letters also showed how cold and manipulative he had been towards Grace. In turn, Grace's desperate words got all the sympathy from the jury, and so did the fact that her unborn fetus was shown during the trial so that no one could dispute her condition. On December 4th, 1906, it took only 5 hours for the jury to find Chester guilty of the murder of Grace Brown, and he was sentenced to death. While being held in prison, Chester was visited by his mother. Though she had visited prisons many times in the past, it's doubtful she would have ever envisaged her son would one day be the other side of the bars. Despite not previously sharing his parents' religious fervour, it's said that while awaiting his date with the electric chair, Chester became a born-again Christian, reportedly confessing to the murder and showing regret for his despicable actions before being sent to meet his maker on March 30th, 1908. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.